Hey everybody. Hope y'all are doing well. Have had good weekends, feeling well rested, all of that good stuff. Um, Today we are going to be talking about health, behavior, and social stress. Some interesting topics, somewhat what we've touched on in previous sessions, but good to dedicate a full class session to. So really the purpose of today is to introduce this concept that health is not solely, again, a result of biological factors, but it's really influenced, deeply influenced by individual behaviors, and which those themselves are actually shaped by social factors. So, talking about the impacts of behavior, of our individual behaviors and health. So, first, starting off, what do we mean by health behavior? Just to make that clear up front. So, health behavior refers to actions taken by individuals that affect their health, either positively or negatively. And then I just want to emphasize the connection between these individual choices and broader societal patterns as well, which we will get into, right? And that's really inherent to sociology, that our unique individual experience is tied into these broader social, cultural, and historical context. The same goes for our behavior. How we behave is very much tied into that. So, thinking about the Barkin reading, again, our textbook reading, chapter 5, a couple of pages in there. Barkin is discussing in this reading lifestyle factors and personal choices that directly impact health. He's talking about things such as diet, exercise, smoking, substance abuse. And the chapter here is highlighting the social determinants of health behavior. So, emphasizing how socioeconomic status and education and community resources play critical roles in shaping and influencing the actual both positive and negative health related behaviors that we engage in, like those things I mentioned: diet, exercise, smoking, substance abuse, substance use. And so the chapter also discusses how social structures create barriers to healthy behaviors for certain populations, which we'll get into. So the chapter talks about the health belief model and the theory of planned behaviors as two different frameworks to understand health related decisions. Just quickly explaining those things. The health belief model, which is discussed, focuses on an individual's perceived risks, benefits, and barriers to taking health related actions. Are there, economic risks? Are there job related risks, like to actually engaging in health related behaviors? Then the theory of planned behavior explores the influence of attitudes and subjective norms and perceived control over behaviors as well. That control piece and that planning one's behavior and that kind of rigid rhythm that people tend to get in. And so these two things illustrate how behaviors like smoking and exercise and diet are influenced not only by elements of personal choice, but by access, by social norms, by cultural expectations, by the groups that we interact with, by the groups we belong to, by the different societies we belong to. These things are heavy influences here. So, just a couple of key points on health and behavior. You see a couple of key points up there. Number one, that health behaviors are shaped by both individual choices and societal constraints. That number two, access to resources and social support plays a significant role. And then three, intersections with race, gender, and socioeconomic status play really key critical roles, as they do in the other conversations too. So in medical sociology, this relationship between health and behavior is explored by examining how personal choices and social factors interact to shape our unique health outcomes. So health behaviors, like the things I mentioned, right? Diet, exercise, smoking, substance use, alcohol consumption. These are frequently seen as individual decisions, but sociological perspectives emphasize that these behaviors are not made in a vacuum, but are profoundly influenced by social structures and social constraints. And so we're going to explore this relationship through some key medical sociological insights. So number one, health behaviors are shaped by both individual choices and societal constraints. So there's three key elements here that I want to discuss. Number one, individual agency. So agency, when we talk about what do we mean by agency in sociology, it's the ability to have control over your actions, that I am going to choose to do this over this. Different people in different societal different places in society, different roles and responsibility and statuses, all that sort of thing, have different levels of agency and control over their individual actions. So here, this individual agency piece, people have some control over their health behaviors, but the extent of this control varies widely. So individual beliefs and motivations and knowledge play roles in choices people make, such as choosing to exercise regularly or choosing to avoid smoking. There's also structural constraints. So while personal choices matter, they absolutely do, sociologists argue that broader social forces can often limit or shape those choices. So economic status, neighborhood conditions, availability of healthy food. Remember, we talked about food deserts, and healthcare access. All of these things can influence an individual's health behavior. So for example, someone in a more low income area may have limited access to safer recreational spaces or affordable, nutritious food, and that limits their ability to make healthy choices, even if they desire to. And then health belief models. So theories like the health belief model or the theory of planned behavior I just mentioned before, these things help to explain how personal beliefs and social pressures shape our health behaviors, our individual health behaviors. And these theories suggest that an individual's behavior depends quite largely upon their perception of risks, of benefits, of barriers, and social norms, all of which are influenced by societal and cultural context. So you think the risks and benefits of certain actions, the barriers to potential healthy choices, the social norms, the norms and modeled behaviors of the certain groups that we're involved in. All of these things have really profound effects on our individual health behaviors. Number two, let's talk about the access to resources and social support plays and how that social support plays a significant role. So first, resource availability. So access to resources such as education and healthcare and safe environments can significantly impact health behaviors. Educational attainment, for instance, is linked to greater health literacy, enabling individuals to understand the benefits of healthy behaviors and avoid more risky ones. In contrast, though, on the other side of things, those with more limited resources often struggle to obtain essential information or access to preventative care, which can hinder those healthy choices. Social support and networks. So social support we talked about as well. Remember we talked about in the specifically in the age and health disparities class session, talking about how as social support declines, so does overall health outcomes too. That social support plays a key role. So social support, including like that type of encouragement from friends, family, and community, has a well-documented impact on health behavior. Positive social networks often encourage behaviors like exercise, healthy eating, and smoking cessation, while also providing emotional support to cope with stress. And conversely, the absence of these types of supports can make it more challenging for individuals to adopt and maintain healthy habits. And then third, there are policy implications. So social support highlights this notion of social support, this idea and this understanding of social support highlights a structural aspect of health behavior that perhaps we have not addressed. So policies that create more supportive environments, for instance, such as subsidized healthy foods, community fitness programs, or mental health and community mental health services can enable much healthier choices at a population level, at an individual level. A good way to target better population health outcomes is thinking about that community support and social support element, which oftentimes when we think about, again, in the medical world, we think, well, what are your best medications? What are your best pharmaceuticals? What are your best treatment plans? But do we think about the downstream effects? Do we think about these ground up components as well, like community impact programs? Intersections with race, gender, and socioeconomic status. So let's talk about each of these. So racial disparities in health behaviors and outcomes are widely documented, and that these disparities often result from a history of structural inequality. So for instance, racial minorities may experience greater obstacles to accessing healthcare, like we've talked about, right? Accessing safe environments and economic opportunities. We talked about that. We've talked about that quite extensively. The limited access to resources can also restrict healthy behavior options. And even more so, experiences of discrimination contribute to chronic stress, which negatively impact health. We talked about all the ways that happens. Gender. So gendered social expectations and norms also influence health behaviors. Men, for example, may be socialized to engage in riskier behaviors, such as heavier drinking or less frequent healthcare utilizations due to norms around masculinity and the traditional expectations there. Women, meanwhile, may face significant health risks associated with reproductive responsibilities or caregiving roles, which can also limit their ability to prioritize self-care and health promoting behaviors. We talked about that at length in the gender class session as well. And then socioeconomic status. Here again, we also had a class session dedicated to this. Socioeconomic status is one of the strongest predictors of health outcomes. So people in higher socioeconomic status, socioeconomic positions, generally have more access to health resources, less exposure to chronic stress, and even a greater ability to engage in preventative behaviors. Whereas lower socioeconomic status is associated with limited access to healthy foods, safe neighborhoods, and healthcare. All of these, of course, as we've talked about, contribute to poorer health outcomes. So consequently, socioeconomic status intersects with race and gender, creating really compounded disadvantages for certain groups, right? How socioeconomic status negatively impacts women and marginalized gender identities, and then marginalized racial minority groups as well. So just as a quick summary, again, as we're talking about medical sociology, these health behaviors that we're talking about, the behaviors that we engage in related to our health, are not merely seen as individual choices, but as actions shaped by these complex social contexts. And that individual agency is constrained or enabled by the access to resources and social support that we all have, and that is disproportionate. So these types of access to resource, social support are structured by social inequalities tied to race, gender, and socioeconomic status. And so this perspective that we're talking about really underscores the importance of addressing societal and social structures to improve public health and reduce disparities, as promoting healthy behavior requires addressing the social conditions that allow to inhibit these behaviors. Again, those downstream approaches. Really, we're not in person here, so we're not going to have an actual discussion. All I want you to think about is how much, of health behavior do you think is actually within individual control versus shaped by those external factors, and where are the lines blurred there? What sort of social factors make it easier or harder for people to engage in healthy behavior? So I encourage you to think about these types of factors like access to safe spaces for exercise, time availability, social norms. And really the key takeaways I want you to get from this is that health behaviors are shaped by both of these things, right? Both individual choices and societal constraints. And look at how those blurred lines occur, how those societal constraints shape our individual behaviors. And also that access to resources and social support, these things play a really critical role in our ability to engage in these healthier behaviors. And then finally, that these factors intersect in really critical ways with issues like things like race, gender, socioeconomic status, and that creates disparities in health outcomes as we think about that further. But let's also get into social stress now, the other part of the day that I wanted to chat through. So just a quick introduction to social stress theory. I think this really, I want to just set the stage for how we understand stress as a social phenomenon, not just an individual experience. That can sometimes be hard to grasp. So social stress are stressors that stem from one's social environment. So there's things like acute stress versus chronic stress. Okay, acute versus chronic stress. Think of acute stress are those things happening in the moment. So sudden job loss, the loss of a relationship, things like that. Whereas chronic stress are things like that are constantly ongoing, like ongoing financial strain, as an example. So think of acute happening more in the moment, chronic stress repeatedly happening and ongoing. So that's the difference between acute stress and chronic stress. And so the social stress model suggests that structural and situational factors impact health by creating or alleviating stress. So both acute and chronic stress, and how that has impacts, as we've shown, that stress has impacts to our actual physical health and mental health outcomes. So Think about the Wheaton and Thwaites reading here. A couple just key points from the Wheaton reading. This reading is examining how social stress is influenced by modern day factors, including economic instability, changing family structures, increased societal pressures, and it's analyzing also how social inequalities exacerbate stress for more marginalized populations, and through that highlighting the impact of stress proliferation, where initial stressors lead to additional stress across areas of life. Kind of, again, thinking similar to that cumulative effect model. So I want to emphasize that piece, the concept of stress proliferation. Think about something like a job loss leading to financial stress, which then impacts family and friend relationships. So see how it's a compounded effect, this stress proliferation, this chain effect, talking about how one stress leads to another stressor leads to another stressor. That's what I mean by stress proliferation. And then I really want you to think about how this reading reflects changes in society that have increased the prevalence of stressors for many individuals. How might that be the case? How has society increased the prevalence of stressor? Through media or through different types of expectations? How we add financial burdens at an earlier age in society, if you think about things like student loans potentially. All those sorts of key changes are really important on how we understand social stress in a modern context. And then the Thwaites reading as well, some key points here from this reading. Thwaites identified major findings in stress research. So particularly focusing on how stress contributes to mental and physical health issues. So that's why I started with the first one, Wheaton identifying, well, what actually is social stress? What are these concepts? And then looking at Thwaites, how it actually impacts society. And so the Thwaites also explains the buffering effect of social support. So this is talking about where strong social networks actually reduce the negative impacts of stress. Our social networks have key impacts on our experience with social stress. And the reading also, Thwaites here discusses policy implications, advocating for support systems that mitigate stress in vulnerable populations, especially marginalized and vulnerable populations. So I want you to think about that buffering effect of social support, that people with strong social connections have better health outcomes. Why might that be the case? Access to resources, interpersonal support. These things are really critical. Network effects. And then tie that back into the role of policy. So I encourage you to consider what social supports might help reduce stress. Things like paid family medical leave, for example, or community centers, or more funded community education programs. All these sorts of community impact programs and initiatives that can actually help influence health behavior and overall health outcomes. So you see a couple of main key takeaways there up on the screen, but just want to emphasize them. One being that social stress is a key determinant of health, with chronic stress leading to both physical and mental health issues. That the buffering effect of social support demonstrates the importance of relationships and community ties. Structural inequalities in society often mean that marginalized groups face higher levels of chronic stress. And then finally, policy solutions such as enhancing social support systems can help to mitigate stress impacts and reduce health disparities. So all of these things are really important to understand. And why are we talking about social stress? Because I hear a lot when I've talked about this, like, well, we all get stressed. We all get stressed. This is what we're talking about, how the impacts of especially compounded social stress in our more marginalized communities, but just in general as well, have impacts on our health behavior and our choice of diet, our choice of exercise, and our habits that impact physical and mental health outcomes. So a little bit more on social stress here. So just a couple of this is kind of just repeats of the previous slide, but just wanted to re-emphasize these things. Again, that social stress determinant of health, the buffering effect, the structural inequalities piece, and then policy solutions and the role of social support systems that we talked about, again, tying these things back into a more actionable front, that the things we talk about in this course, we should be applying back into what are applications in medical fields through policy solutions. So again, from medical sociology perspective, this social stress is a really fundamental factor in what actually shapes our health outcome, because it shapes our health behaviors really critically. And so this approach emphasizes that stress does not just stem from our individual circumstances, but it's really embedded in our social structures, often exacerbating health inequalities. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at how social stress actually impacts health, the role of social supports, the influence of structural inequalities, and the potential for policy solutions to address these issues further. So number one, social stress is a determinant of health. Number one, chronic stress and health outcomes. So social stress refers to the stress people experience due to their social environment. This includes factors like economic instability, job insecurity, neighborhood safety, and interpersonal conflict. So chronic stress, especially that ongoing chronic stress can lead to numerous health problems, both physical and mental. So for example, prolonged exposure to stress can actually increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, immune system dysfunction, and mental health disorders like anxiety and depression. So chronic stress is a really key factor, fundamental in our health outcomes. That second component there, stress as a socially mediated experience. So unlike acute temporary stress, again, the types of things like maybe it's a one-time job interview, right? Those types of acute stress moments, chronic stress is what I want you to focus on, because chronic stress is often related to persistent societal factors and conditions beyond individual control. And this makes it difficult for individuals to manage or escape stress without those broader changes in their social or economic context. So medical sociology really emphasizes that the effects of chronic stress, not just acute stress, but really focusing on that chronic stress, that ongoing stress situations like financial burdens, these things have really profound impacts on health, and they're not just biological, but really deeply influenced by one's place in societal structure, in the societal hierarchy. There's also the buffering effect of social support that's really important to highlight. So that first bullet there, the protective role of social support. So research shows that social support from family and friends and community networks can buffer or reduce or mitigate the negative impact of stress on our health. So social support provides emotional comfort, practical assistance, and a sense of belonging that can help individuals cope with stressful situations more effectively. And this protective effect means that people with strong social ties are often better equipped to manage stress and experience better health outcomes. There's different types of support too. So social support can be emotional. It can be like providing reassurance and that sort of thing. It can be instrumental. Maybe you're providing actual material or practical help, or support can also be informational. Maybe you're offering guidance or advice. So each type here can reduce the impact of stress by helping individuals feel less isolated and more equipped to handle challenges. So again, just repeating those three types of social support: emotional, providing sort of reassurance and connection; instrumental, actually providing material or practical help. Maybe it's helping pay someone's rent or medical bills; or even informational, where you're offering guidance and advice of how to go through this situation, how to address it and better it. And then community and social capital. So on a larger scale, community ties and social capital, again, thinking about what does this mean? So these are the referring to the networks of relationships among people who live in a particular society. So again, thinking about those community ties and social capital pieces, these can foster a supportive environment that benefits public health. So communities with higher social capital often promote mental resilience and shared resources, helping residents collectively buffer stress, particularly during difficult times. Continuing on to a third point here, the structural inequalities and chronic stress in marginalized groups. So let's, number one, health disparities and social hierarchy. So structural inequalities such as discrimination, economic inequality, and lack of access to resources, these types of structural inequalities intensify stress for marginalized populations, including racial minorities, low-income individuals, and women in society. And these groups often experience greater exposure to chronic stressors like unsafe neighborhoods, job insecurity, systemic discrimination, these things that put them at a higher risk for stress-related health issues, and particularly not just acute, but also chronic stress, related health issues. There's also an intersectionality of stressors. So like we talked intersectionality of identities and groups and these social influences, there's an intersectionality of stressors as well. So for many marginalized groups, stress is compounded by these intersecting disadvantages, we call them. So for instance, a low-income single mother of color might face financial strain or racial discrimination and limited social support all at once. And so this creates a heightened level of chronic stress where it's all these different factors intersecting at the same time. And so this intersectionality reinforces health disparities, as people who face multiple sources of disadvantage are more likely to suffer from chronic health issues. Then there's this allostatic load. So medical sociology uses the concept of allostatic load. This is referring to the cumulative wear and tear on the body due to chronic stress. Okay, that's what the allostatic load refers to. And this helps to explain how long-term exposure to stressors actually formally leads to worse health outcomes. So marginalized groups often exhibit higher allostatic loads. They have these higher cumulative wear and tears of chronic stress for all the reasons we've already talked about. And overall, this contributes to earlier onsets of diseases and shorter life expectancy. So again, this allostatic load is just talking about kind of that cumulative effect of all the things you talked about, and then pointing out how that directly impacts life expectancy, health experiences, and health outcomes. Really, the final thing here, one of the final things here, this fourth piece, policy solutions and the role of social support systems. So let's talk about this. So that first bullet, enhancing social support systems. Policy interventions that provide social support or reduce stress-inducing inequalities can have really powerful impacts on public health. So for instance, policies like paid family medical leave, like we have in Minnesota, and that is coming out soon, we're implementing. Affordable housing initiatives, mental health services, and income support programs. All these things help to reduce sources of chronic stress, especially when targeted for specifically vulnerable populations. And that obviously then has really key impacts on our general population and public health. Community resources and social programs. So community centers, affordable childcare, and accessible healthcare services. All these things can provide direct support to individuals while also fostering social connections that can help to mitigate stress, as we've talked about, right? So such programs like this, they're especially critical in low income or high stress neighborhoods where residents might lack other forms of social support. And then finally, addressing structural inequality. So policies that address the root causes of inequality, those downstream effects of inequality, such as reforming housing policies, increasing access to quality education, and combating systemic discrimination. These things can reduce the chronic stress burden on marginalized groups. And addressing these structural factors has a really broad stream, a broad impact, improving health outcomes by removing stressors and providing support. So just as just a brief summary here, again, from that medical sociology perspective, as we talked about, that social stress component is not just an individual issue, but it's deeply rooted in our societal structures. And that's chronic stress from persistent social inequalities can lead to significant physical and mental health issues, with marginalized groups being a disproportionate, bearing a disproportionate burden. And social support offers a really vital buffer in this equation, in this conversation, and it highlights the importance of relationships and community ties for resilience against chronic and acute stress. So ultimately, addressing social stress from a policy perspective requires more systemic solutions that reduce inequality. You'll hear that over and over throughout this class, right? That to address health, we have to address inequality. And so enhance social support as well, and mitigate stressors at the community and societal levels. Again, we're not in person, we're not going to actually have this discussion, but just we've talked about the key takeaways of social stress. Those are the ones I just mentioned in the previous slide, but just some main takeaways here that I want you to have post these readings and post this session is that, number one, social stress is a really key determinant of health as well, with chronic stress leading to both physical and mental health issues. 2, the buffering effect of social support demonstrates the importance of relationships, social networks, and community ties. 3, structural inequalities in society often mean that marginalized groups face higher levels of chronic stress. And then finally, policy solutions such as enhancing social support systems can help to mitigate stress impacts and reduce health disparities. Okay, that's our session for today on health behavior, social stress. They're really important topics, and we've hit on them a little bit throughout the other sections, right? As we talk about race, gender, age, all these sorts of things. But it's important to dedicate a specific section on the impacts of social stress and on health behaviors and how those things are shaped socially and by our structure in society. So, as always, if you have any questions at all, you can message me. We can meet one-on-one. Anything that you need, any questions that you have, we can answer. But thanks everybody for tuning in today. Looking forward to the next session as always. But until then, we'll see you.